Hello again from my front porch. I'm in Washington, D.C. Well, the D.C. area. Technically, I'm in Alexandria, Virginia. Well, technically, I'm in what's called Roslyn. But even more technically, I'm in the Homewood Suites, which is where I've been staying during my business trip here to DC. And this is, I gotta tell you, it's a fabulous place. It's got this big bathroom. It's got a whole little kitchen area back here. And when I say kitchen, I mean kitchen with the refrigerator on the other side. They have actual real utensils in the drawers and everything. Dishwasher down over here. It's unbelievable. A little work area space here. But the reason I'm doing this one is not just to brag about my room, but because in my room is this image. It's a vintage image of the District of Columbia, the 68 square mile area that we know as the District of Columbia. And of course, that's a big topic right now. Should the District of Columbia be a state? Instead of being the District of Columbia, should be the State of Columbia. And I just want to give a little bit of history about this, but I also want to, of course, express my opinion, which I tend to do. But so first of all, let's look back. Now, there are some people who mistakenly say, well, it can't be a state because it's in the Constitution. Look it up. Well, I challenge you to look it up. It's not there. Because when the Constitution was passed, all of this area here, this 68 square miles, was actually part of the state of Maryland. It wasn't until 1791, I believe, after the Constitution was adopted, that the state of Maryland ceded all of this land to the federal government for use in making the nation's capital. That's where this 68 square mile box came from. And now the reason that was done was because it was believed that no one state should have ownership or rights over the nation's capital, that it should be apart from everything else. And there are those today, myself included, who still believe that is the case. Now, let me give you an example, just to illustrate this, and just hang with me. Don't react just to the example. Just understand I'm using it as an example. But right now, with COVID going on, we all have to be wearing our masks. The masks that we wear over our faces. We know President Trump does not like wearing a mask. Now, there are various reasons that he might not like wearing a mask. Personally, I think one of the reasons he doesn't like wearing the mask is because he wears a whole lot of that makeup, that stuff that makes him, people say makes him look orange, but tan, whatever it is. And I think he's afraid that if he wore a mask, he'd rub a lot of it off. But whatever the reason may be, he doesn't like wearing a mask. Well, now he's been going out to do things, appearances, and even events in states where there are regulations around wearing masks, where the governor of a state or the health body of a state has either mandated or at least strongly suggested that masks be worn, especially in certain contexts, which cover what President Trump is there doing. Now, there are those that then say, well, but the president doesn't have to abide by those rules because those are state level rules, and this is the president of the United States. He doesn't have to do what a state says is the restriction. He can do what the federal restrictions or guidelines would be, and there are no such guidelines on a federal level. Now, we can argue whether masks should be worn. We can argue whether Trump is right or wrong about that, but that example is the heart of the issue about why this 68 square miles is dedicated to the nation's capital and not part of a state. Because imagine, if you will, that little scenario, that goofy little scenario about the face mask. Imagine taking that scenario and applying it to any other context. Picture, if you will, a situation in which this box becomes a state, and we have the state of Columbia with its own governor, its own legislator, or own legislatures, legislators making a legislature. I was going to get it right eventually. but they have their own governing body, and that governing body begins to implement rules, guidelines, restrictions, and limitations on people who live there and people who work there, just as any other state does. That is going to include our national representatives, which means our national government officials, executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch, all of them are going to have to abide by rules and guidelines and do whatever is mandated upon them by one specific state that none of the other states have any say in. Nobody else in the nation has any control over what those guidelines are. but they impact the representatives of all of us. Now, you say, well, what's the problem with that? They're not going to do anything weird. They're going to really stop and think for a moment about the things in your own state that you don't agree with. Now imagine stuff happening here that you don't agree with. How would you feel that that now is a requirement of the President of the United States or members of Congress or members of the Supreme Court to have to do certain things or abide by certain things? And I'm not just talking about face masks now. I'm talking about anything that's limited by a state entity. See, that was exactly the scenario that the founders did not want. That was exactly the scenario they wanted to avoid. That no state would be able to either claim ownership of the nation's capital, and no state would be able to have influence, to manipulate, to work with things, to affect the way stuff is done in the nation's capital. That's why it is a district and not a state, and that is why I think it needs to stay that way as well. Now, I do believe that it has become a population center that the founders did not envision it to be. For example, right now, where I am right now, this is Georgetown here. Let me bring the camera in closer. This is Georgetown here. That's where our office is here in Georgetown. And this, which is called Mason Island here, Mason's Island, is now what has actually been renamed as Teddy Roosevelt Island, which I've been there previously and done a video at Roosevelt's Island. That's really cool. But so I'm actually kind of in this vicinity here right now. I'm in Virginia right now. In this area here is the Potomac River. But then over here, you see here's where we get the White House and the Capitol and all of these things right in this area in what is called on this map Washington City. Yeah, Georgetown and Washington City. See, George Washington. See, you get it. But so all of those things are here. And then down here at the tip of it is the city of Alexandria as well. Although obviously that has expanded. This all has expanded farther here. And it's starting to stretch the boundaries, actually, of that 68 square mile region. But within there are now what? I think the last number I saw, 700,000 residents in this 68 square mile space. That's a lot of people squeezed into that space. That is not a vision that the founders had. The founders did not see this as being a center of residence. They saw this as being a center of government, and that citizen legislators would come and go. And so there needed to be some places for them to live, and there needed to be some businesses to support them while they were there. But that was it. That was all they envisioned. They did not envision this becoming a metropolis area. They did not envision that at all. So while I do think that the areas that govern our nation need to be their own separate district, it may not need to be a whole 68 square miles. In fact, I've heard the suggestion made, and I am fully on board with this, that they should shrink down the size of the District of Columbia to only encompass the governmental buildings and facilities and grounds, maybe the National Mall and the Smithsonian's and all of that kind of stuff, and the federal office buildings and all those things, which are all for the most part grouped together in a smaller space there in that region comparatively to the whole 68 square miles. But they should shrink down the District of Columbia to just that national government, national stuff, shrink it down to there, and then take the rest of it and just like draw a line here and say this part goes back to Maryland and maybe this part goes to Virginia. Because that way, there would still be some people who might be living in some areas around there that would still be part of the District of Columbia. But the majority of people who are complaining that they are not getting representation in Congress right now because they don't have an elected representative, they don't have elected senators, they don't have that. Now, they do have influence with Congress because Congress actually runs the District of Columbia. That's how they are governed. They have a mayor, which they're able to elect, and they are able to have have some votes now, but it's all been within the 20th century that stuff even started. For a long time, the residents who were here had no voice per se, because the founders never expected there to be residents who needed a voice. that was not the plan. But we've had this whole industry, this whole group, everybody that's built up around here that support this massive monstrosity known as our federal government, which I believe is too big too. But that's a whole nother matter. But still, I think the case can definitely be made for all of these other people here in all these areas that are not part of these government facilities that are in this kind of area right here. All of those people, they do deserve to be represented. They should be represented. And does the District of Columbia, does it still need to be 68 square miles? No, I don't think it does. I don't think there is a reason it must stay this square diamond shape any longer. I think a solid case can be made to shrink down the District of Columbia to just the areas where actual federal business is happening, and then make the rest part of other states. Don't make it a new state. We don't need another new state. And it's, it's small. Granted, Rhode Island is pretty small too, but just draw a line and say, this is now Maryland, this is now Virginia, and just redraw the lines, and then those people, they get the representation. Odds are Virginia and Maryland probably would gain at least one representative as well because of the population increase that would do. They wouldn't gain a senator because every state only gets 2 senators, but there would be representation now for those people. So I think that's a really great compromise that still allows us to maintain the integrity of why this area was set aside, that it's not made a state, that it's made a separate district that's managed by the federal government itself. I think that still needs to be maintained, but a good compromise is to shrink it down, focus just on what actually is the federal government area, and let the rest of this area go back to the states that are adjacent so that those people can have their proper representation. Well, that's my thoughts. I'll be curious to see what you have to say. And with that, I'll see y'all next time from my front porch.